Hey guys, Dwayne Estes here, Executive Director of the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, and I hope you guys will join me for a little bit of what we call story time. All across the Midwest and in places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, it's well known that cemeteries like the one behind me can be great places to find prairie remnants. And in places like Iowa, that makes a lot of sense, right? You could have big, broad, flat expanses of what used to be prairie. And as all that was converted to cornfields, there are tiny little bits of prairie, in some cases a quarter acre or a tenth of an acre, that remain in these cemeteries that haven't been plowed for agriculture. Now, here in Tennessee, we don't have a lot of that. We have some on railroad rights of way and highway embankments, but these kinds of cemeteries throughout most of our state kind of have a different history and tell a different story. So I'm here in the outer Nashville Basin of Tennessee. You can see the rolling hills in the distance. Those hills historically were all forested with some of the richest forests that have been described in Tennessee. But what was this area like in these broad basins? That's part of an enigma that really hasn't been solved. So to understand that, we have to look at a variety of sources. We look at the plants and animals that might be found today in these areas. So if we were to go out there in those bottomlands, for example, and find remnant prairie species along the edges of the creeks or the edges of the fields, that's a story into itself. If, for example, if we found gamma grass hanging out there and various kinds of sunflowers. But in this case, we don't find those. And does that mean they never existed? Or does that mean they were just simply depleted and they've been gone for a long time? We can also look to old trees. I got on here the other day, I was telling you guys about blackjack oak and post oak and the stories that they tell. Well, in this case, those two species don't really occur in the outer Nashville Basin. The soils here are deep and rich, full of phosphorus, and they naturally, you would think, would support tree growth. But there are some rocky areas in the Nashville Basin, however, that are quite different, that do have a lot of post oaks and some blackjack oaks. So again, it's about reading the lay of the land. And another one that comes to mind, of course, is old historical descriptions and quotes from early settlers. So in that case, that's one of the things we have to go back to here in the Nashville Basin. But there's a problem. The earliest settlers who came in the 1770s and 1780s didn't really have the chance to be writing about the landscape. They were just trying to survive, and they were trying to survive repeated Native American attacks, especially in the first 10 years. So in this case, the earliest documentation we have about the landscape of the Nashville Basin really comes from about the 1860s. There's the state's first geologist, a guy named James Safford, published a book about the geological resources of Tennessee in, I think, 1869. This is after the Civil War. We can also look to 1874, where there's a book published about the agricultural resources of Tennessee, where they go through each county and they talk about this county is great for sheep production, this county is great for timber production. And in that, they often give those kinds of clues about what the landscape was like as of the 1860s and 1870s. But what we don't have is we don't have many examples of pre-Civil War records for much of the Middle Tennessee area. In fact, many areas of parts of the South don't have that. So how do we get that deeper level of knowledge? It's about reading all the clues together to kind of come up with that. So in one of those documents from 1869, James Safford is looking at these open, rocky limestone glades, which we consider with SGI to be types of rocky, almost desert-like grasslands. And in there, he talks about the areas around these glades as supporting dense forests of red cedar. Very tall, not redwood tall or even tulip poplar tall, but probably 40 to 50 feet tall and of large size. And he calls those cedar forests old growth. Now, they were so extensive in many areas of Middle Tennessee that they supported a pencil industry, and that these cedars were being logged out in the early and especially in the mid and later part of the 1800s to support that cedar industry, and cedar wood was very much used. So we don't have any of those big cedars left anymore in most places. If you go to most limestone glades, you go into the glades, it's really, really encroached with cedars and various hardwoods, but they're all usually of a small size. So are there any big cedar trees remaining in the Nashville Basin that might tell that story? Well, remember what we said about prairies, how cemeteries preserve those little bitty prairie remnants in the Midwest because nobody's plowing in a cemetery. The same is true for some of these big trees. So here I am in a churchyard in the outer Nashville Basin. There's a church here that dates to the 1800s. And in this churchyard is the kind of place where we might expect to see some still original trees from 200 to possibly 300 years ago. Let's take a look. Here behind me is the state's largest eastern red cedar tree. Now I'm going to see if you can see that. And this tree is actually the state champion. It's been here for who knows how long. I remember coming here as a high school kid back in the 1990s and measuring this giant tree. And let's do a little bit of tree hugging. This tree is over 13 feet in circumference. That's right. So this is a tree that if you were to look at it in some directions is probably 5 feet or so in diameter. So one of the ways we could get at this would be to take some cores of this tree, stuff like what our friends who are dendrochronologists do, and you could take the cores of this tree. Number one, you'd want to know how old is the tree. But secondly, you could look at those tree rings and determine to some extent, now this is one tree, you could determine to some extent whether it went through some type of release, for example, meaning were there times in the history of this tree maybe when it was growing in a very condensed scenario of having a lot of trees around it. Maybe if all those trees around it were cut, sometimes you'll see that as evidence in the tree ring where we would call that sort of a release. The rings could expand because competition has been reduced. So if we could put together a bunch of these old cedars, perhaps looking in churchyards across Middle Tennessee, then maybe we might be able to begin to piece together a little bit of the history of this region. So I want to tell you that because I feel like trees, again, are an important part of understanding our southeastern grasslands. We should abandon the view that all grasslands are treeless. I mean, certainly the Great Plains were, and here in Tennessee we had large expansive areas of treeless prairie, for example. But many types of grasslands throughout the South, whether you're in the lonely pine savannas of Florida or the oak savannas of central Tennessee and southern Missouri, many of our grasslands actually have quite a bit of tree cover. And so by studying tree rings and partnering with dendrochronologists and dendroecologists, we can better understand this. Last thing I'll say is there are still many areas of the South for which we don't have that kind of record, and we still need it. There's a lot of records from tree ring studies in places east of Middle Tennessee on the Cumberland Plateau and the Blue Ridge Mountains, but there's really almost nothing here in the mid-state, in parts of North Alabama, parts of Mississippi. So we really, really need to continue to recognize trees, not for their value always as forming forests, but recognizing that certain tree species are equally important components of savannas, open grassy woodland habitats as well. All right, guys, so from the outer Nashville Basin of Middle Tennessee, here with the state champion eastern red cedar, over 5 feet in diameter. I hope you guys can develop a fuller appreciation of these kinds of churchyards and the kind of role that old trees can tell in this story of southern grasslands that we're trying to tell over the course of time. You guys have a good day. I'm going to check in with you a little bit later. I'm actually going down to see a prairie remnant that I used to study as a high school kid. It's been 15 years since I've been there. Let's see if we could take a bet on whether that prairie remnant is still there or not. Part of me is scared that my heart is going to sink as I'm driving down the road where it used to be for fear that it won't be there anymore. All right, guys, take care. We'll check in with you later.